I want to challenge something you almost certainly believe about memory loss after 60. Something that feels so settled, so accepted, so consistently reinforced by everything you have heard from doctors, from family, from the general cultural conversation about aging, that questioning it might feel almost naive. The belief is this: memory decline after 60 is an inevitable, largely irreversible process that you manage but cannot meaningfully reverse. You can slow it, perhaps. You can do puzzles and stay socially engaged and hope for the best, but the neurons you have lost are gone. The connections that have degraded, and the trajectory, while not identical for everyone, is fundamentally one direction. I am here to tell you that this belief, while understandable given how consistently it has been communicated, is not what the most current neuroscience actually shows. And the gap between what people believe about memory and aging and what the research now demonstrates is one of the most important and most underutilized pieces of clinical information available to any adult over 60 who is willing to hear it. My name is Dr. Calvin Hayes. I am a neurologist, and I have spent over 20 years working exclusively with patients over the age of 60. The science of neuroplasticity, which is simply the brain's capacity to form new neural connections, reorganize existing ones, and in certain circumstances regenerate structure in response to the right inputs, has advanced more rapidly in the last decade than in the previous 50 years combined. And one of the most consistent and most replicable findings in this emerging science is that specific dietary compounds have a direct and measurable effect on the brain's ability to maintain, repair, and in some cases expand the neural infrastructure that supports memory function in adults over 60. Not supplements, not pharmaceutical interventions. Food. Specific foods consumed daily in amounts that are completely practical and completely accessible, producing neurological changes that show up not just in how memory feels subjectively, but in how the brain looks structurally on imaging, and how it performs on standardized cognitive assessments. I want to give you 4 of those foods today, and I want to give you not just the what, but the precise biological why behind each one. Because understanding why something works is what makes it feel worth doing consistently, rather than for a week and then abandoning. But before I get to the 4 foods, I need to address something that most people in this conversation never stop to question. Because the myth I am about to bust is the foundation that makes everything else I say either land with real weight or get dismissed as wishful thinking. The myth is that the adult brain, particularly the brain over 60, cannot grow new neurons or form meaningful new neural connections. That what you have is what you have, and the best you can do is maintain it. Here is what the research actually shows. In 1998, a landmark study published in the journal Nature Medicine demonstrated for the first time that neurogenesis, which simply means the birth of new neurons, occurs in the adult human hippocampus throughout life. Not just in childhood, not just in young adulthood, in the adult hippocampus, in the region of the brain most directly responsible for forming and retrieving memories. This finding was genuinely revolutionary because it contradicted decades of established neurological perisenwargaldebal, but the hippocampus waar Ewing te Paldova, a meksum silverlalbik en hempel feiralbe, wat dreek fris menens farpa mutsamishad, wat dreddy benefer hospitame, wat witgetin jorge plek a badier kolfer 6 de kiri simblav, in this jeer is in a cowberbis of this in jorgaldebo. Wat you almond to turking to tier to cowbies and heapus of fat come to leave over farm, and mundlepinium evelping stedavite labe, and to twinelish van the nurkin boot membran, called plikkel. Der ujik or alps and poldy fine spelnaf that beneath fiber twine the jik simbleth the with that you colsewer. To dostamat the shavmin be scuffed the stelez the mid trefag. When just cumulative commentate doctrine and opened an entirely new line of research into what stimulates neurogenesis and what suppresses it. What followed over the next 2 decades was an accumulating body of research identifying the specific factors that either promote or inhibit hippocampal neurogenesis and neuroplasticity in adults. Exercise was one of the most powerful promoters, social engagement was another, cognitive challenge, quality sleep, and diet. Specifically certain dietary compounds that interact directly with the molecular pathways governing the growth and survival of new neurons. The most important of these molecular pathways involves a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. BDNF is sometimes described by neuroscientists as fertilizer for the brain because its primary function is to support the growth, maintenance, and survival of neurons and the connections between them. Higher BDNF levels are associated with better memory performance, greater hippocampal volume, and reduced risk of cognitive decline. Lower BDNF levels are associated with accelerated memory loss, hippocampal shrinkage, and increased Alzheimer's risk. And certain foods consumed regularly produce measurable increases in BDNF. Not marginally, significantly, in ways that show up in blood markers, in cognitive testing, and in the brain imaging of people who eat them consistently over months and years. This is not wishful thinking. This is molecular neuroscience. And it is the foundation of everything I am about to tell you about the 4 foods that belong on your plate every single day after 60. Now I want to address one more layer of the myth before we get to the foods themselves. Because there is a version of the food and brain health conversation that is genuinely oversimplified and that I want to distinguish clearly from what I am describing. The oversimplified version says eat these foods and your memory will be restored. As if cognition were a simple input-output system, where the right dietary input produces a guaranteed cognitive output, independent of everything else that is happening in your brain and your life. That is not what I am saying. What I am saying is more specific and more honest than that. Specific dietary compounds consumed consistently over time create neurological conditions that are more favorable for memory function, neural repair, and cognitive resilience. They do not override genetics. They do not reverse established structural damage. They do not work in isolation from sleep, exercise, stress management, and cardiovascular health. But they contribute meaningfully and measurably to a brain environment that is either more or less capable of maintaining and recovering memory function after 60. And for many adults over 60, the dietary contribution to that brain environment has been essentially negligible, not because they eat poorly in a general sense, because they have not been told which specific compounds their aging brain is most dependent on and which foods deliver those compounds most efficiently. I am going to tell you now, and I want you to stay through all 4 foods because the 4th one is the one that surprises people most consistently, the one that almost nobody over 60 is eating in adequate amounts, and the one that the research suggests may have the most direct and specific effect on the hippocampal function that governs memory formation and retrieval. Do not skip ahead. The first food is blueberries. And before you dismiss this, because you have heard it before, I want to give you the specific mechanism that most versions of this conversation never explain clearly enough to make it feel real. Blueberries contain a class of compounds called anthocyanins. These are the pigments that give blueberries their deep blue color. Anthocyanins cross the blood-brain barrier, which is the protective membrane that controls what enters the brain from the bloodstream. And once inside the brain, they do several things simultaneously that are directly relevant to memory function after 60. They reduce neuroinflammation. Chronic low-grade inflammation in brain tissue is now understood to be one of the primary drivers of age-related cognitive decline and one of the key mechanisms through which Alzheimer's pathology develops. Anthocyanins are among the most potent natural anti-inflammatory compounds that research has identified as capable of acting specifically within brain tissue rather than systemically. They improve blood flow to the hippocampus specifically. A study published in the European Journal of Nutrition used functional MRI imaging to measure blood flow to specific brain regions in older adults before and after a period of daily blueberry consumption. The results showed a measurable increase in blood flow to the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, both regions critical for memory and executive function. In the blueberry group compared to the control group, more blood flow means more oxygen and more glucose delivered to the neurons that depend on them for their function and survival. And they increase BDNF. Multiple studies have shown that regular blueberry consumption is associated with elevated BDNF levels in older adults. More BDNF means more support for the new neurons being generated in the hippocampus and more stability for the existing neural networks that memory depends on. A clinical trial published in the journal Nutrients studied older adults with mild cognitive concerns who consumed the equivalent of 1 cup of blueberries daily for 12 weeks. The group consuming blueberries showed significantly better performance on memory tasks compared to the control group, and those improvements were associated with measurable changes in brain activation patterns on imaging. 1 cup of blueberries daily, fresh or frozen, the anthocyanin content is essentially equivalent, added to yogurt, oatmeal, a smoothie, or eaten on their own. That is the dose the research supports, and it is a dose that fits into any morning without disruption. Do you currently eat blueberries daily? And if not, when did you last eat them at all? That honest self-assessment matters because the gap between knowing a food is beneficial and actually eating it consistently every day is where most of the real work happens. The second food is fatty fish. And I want to be specific about which fish and why, because the general category of healthy fish is a much broader and less useful recommendation than what the research actually supports. The specific compounds that matter here are the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA. DHA, which stands for docosahexaenoic acid, is a structural component of brain cell membranes. Approximately 60% of the dry weight of the human brain is fat, and DHA is the most abundant omega-3 fatty acid in brain tissue, particularly in the membranes of neurons in the hippocampus and cortex. It is not simply a nutrient that is good for the brain in a general wellness sense. It is literally part of the physical structure of the neurons that your memory depends on. After 60, the brain's ability to synthesize DHA from dietary precursors declines. The most efficient way to maintain adequate brain DHA levels is to consume it directly in food, and the foods with the highest concentrations of preformed DHA are fatty cold water fish, specifically salmon, sardines, mackerel, herring, and anchovies. These are not interchangeable with white fish or with freshwater fish in terms of DHA content. The specific species matter. A large prospective study published in the journal JAMA Internal Medicine followed over 2,000 older adults for 5 years and found that those with the highest blood levels of DHA had a significantly lower risk of developing dementia and showed meaningfully slower rates of cognitive decline compared to those with the lowest levels. The association held after controlling for other dietary factors, cardiovascular health, education, and genetic risk factors. A separate analysis of brain imaging data from the Framingham Heart Study found that adults with higher DHA levels had measurably greater brain volume, specifically greater hippocampal volume, than those with lower levels. The difference in hippocampal volume associated with DHA status was comparable in magnitude to the difference associated with years of aging. In other words, adequate DHA was associated with a brain that looked structurally younger than inadequate DHA, measured in brain volume in the same age group. 2 to 3 servings of fatty fish per week delivers the DHA the research associates with meaningful cognitive benefit. If fatty fish is genuinely not an option in your diet, a high-quality algae-based DHA supplement delivers the same compound in the same form. Algae is where fish obtain their DHA in the first place, so the supplement bypasses the fish and goes directly to the original source. Now we arrive at the third food, and the answer to a question that most people in this conversation have never thought to ask. What does your gut have to do with your memory? The third food is fermented foods, specifically naturally fermented foods that contain live bacterial cultures. Foods like plain yogurt with live active cultures, kefir, kimchi, sauerkraut, and miso. And the reason these foods belong on a brain health list rather than only a digestive health list is one of the most important scientific developments of the past decade. The discovery of what researchers now call the gut-brain axis. Your gut contains approximately 100 trillion microorganisms. The community of bacteria, fungi, and other microbes that live in your digestive tract is called your microbiome. And over the past decade, research has revealed that this microbiome communicates directly with your brain through multiple pathways. Through the vagus nerve, which is the primary neural highway between your gut and your brain, through the production of neurotransmitters, including approximately 90% of your body's serotonin and significant amounts of GABA, both of which directly affect mood, cognition, and memory. And through the regulation of systemic inflammation, including neuroinflammation in the brain itself. A healthy, diverse microbiome is associated with lower levels of neuroinflammation, higher BDNF levels, and better cognitive function in aging adults. A depleted or dysbiotic microbiome, which simply means an imbalanced microbiome with reduced diversity, is associated with higher neuroinflammation, lower BDNF, and accelerated cognitive decline. Research published in the journal Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience found that older adults with greater gut microbiome diversity showed significantly better performance on memory and cognitive assessments than those with lower diversity. A separate study found that probiotic supplementation in older adults with mild cognitive impairment produced measurable improvements in cognitive test scores compared to placebo, and that these improvements were associated with changes in inflammatory markers that the probiotic intervention had produced. Fermented foods feed and diversify your microbiome in ways that probiotic supplements replicate partially but not completely, because fermented foods contain not just bacterial strains, but the full ecosystem of compounds those bacteria produce and the prebiotics that sustain them. A daily serving of plain yogurt with live cultures, a small portion of kimchi or sauerkraut, or a glass of kefir delivers this benefit in a form your gut can use immediately. I want to pause here for a moment because we are now 2/3 of the way through these 4 foods, and I want to acknowledge something directly. The first 3 foods are ones that most people have heard associated with brain health in some form. Blueberries, fish, fermented foods. They may feel familiar even if the depth of the mechanism I have described is new. The 4th food is different. It is one that almost nobody over 60 is eating in adequate daily amounts. One that most people do not associate with memory or brain health at all. One that the research on hippocampal neurogenesis and BDNF suggests may be the single most underutilized dietary tool for memory protection in aging adults. And one that I have been specifically recommending to every patient over 60 in my practice for the past several years based on that research. Stay with me for this one because it is the reason I wanted you to watch all the way through. The 4th food is dark leafy greens, specifically spinach, kale, Swiss chard, collard greens, and arugula. Consumed daily in amounts of at least 1 to 2 cups and prepared in ways that maximize bioavailability, which I will explain in a moment. The specific compounds that make dark leafy greens so powerfully relevant to memory function after 60 are folate, vitamin K, lutein, and nitrates. And I want to briefly explain what each one does in the brain, because the combined effect of these 4 compounds working together is the reason this food category produces cognitive benefits that no single supplement has successfully replicated. Folate, which is the natural form of the B vitamin found in whole foods rather than the synthetic folic acid in supplements, is essential for the production of neurotransmitters, including dopamine and serotonin. It is also essential for a process called methylation, which regulates gene expression in neurons and directly influences the rate of neural repair. Low folate in older adults is consistently associated with elevated homocysteine, which is an amino acid that at high levels is directly toxic to neurons and is one of the most significant nutritional risk factors for dementia identified in the research. Vitamin K activates proteins in the brain that are involved in the synthesis of sphingolipids, which are fats that are critical components of myelin. Myelin is the protective sheath that surrounds nerve fibers and that allows electrical signals to travel efficiently between neurons. When myelin integrity is compromised, signal transmission slows and memory retrieval becomes less efficient. Vitamin K from dietary sources specifically supports myelin maintenance in ways that are particularly relevant after 60. Lutein is a carotenoid that accumulates in the brain, particularly in regions associated with memory and learning. Multiple studies have shown that brain lutein levels in older adults are directly correlated with cognitive performance, and that adults with higher lutein levels perform better on memory tasks, processing speed assessments, and tests of cognitive flexibility. The brain cannot synthesize lutein. It must come from food, and dark leafy greens are among the richest sources. And nitrates. The dietary nitrates in dark leafy greens are converted in the body into nitric oxide. Nitric oxide dilates blood vessels throughout the body, including the tiny vessels that supply the hippocampus and cortex. Research published in the journal Nitric Oxide found that older adults who consumed dietary nitrates from vegetables showed measurably improved cerebral blood flow to regions involved in memory function compared to those who did not. More blood flow to the memory regions of the brain means more oxygen, more glucose, and more efficient neural function. A landmark longitudinal study from Rush University Medical Center followed nearly 1,000 older adults for approximately 5 years, and found that those who consumed at least 1 serving of dark leafy greens daily had a rate of cognitive decline that was significantly slower than those who rarely or never consumed them. The researchers estimated that the daily leafy green consumers showed cognitive performance equivalent to being approximately 11 years younger than their actual age compared to those who did not eat them. 11 years of apparent cognitive youth from a daily serving of spinach or kale. The bioavailability point I mentioned matters here. The fat-soluble vitamins in dark leafy greens, including vitamin K and lutein, are absorbed significantly more efficiently when the greens are consumed alongside a source of healthy fat. A drizzle of olive oil on sautéed spinach. a handful of kale in a salad dressed with avocado. These combinations are not just culinary preferences, they are biologically meaningful pairings that determine how much of the benefit your brain actually receives from each serving. I had a patient named Miriam, 72 years old, retired librarian. She came to me 18 months ago with concerns about her memory that were real and specific rather than vague. She was forgetting things she had always been sharp about: names, dates, sequences. She was frightened. Her mother had had Alzheimer's disease, and Miriam had been quietly dreading the same trajectory for years. Miriam's assessment showed early-stage subjective cognitive decline, which is the clinical term for the stage where someone notices real changes in their memory and cognition that do not yet meet the criteria for mild cognitive impairment, but that the research identifies as meaningful risk period. She was not yet in trouble in a clinical sense, but she was at the beginning of a trajectory that warranted everything she could bring to bear on it. We talked about diet, specifically about these 4 foods. At the time, Miriam was eating blueberries occasionally, fish twice a month, no fermented foods at all, and virtually no dark leafy greens because she had never particularly enjoyed them and nobody had ever given her a compelling reason to change that. I gave her the mechanism, all of it, the BDNF, the neuroinflammation, the gut-brain axis, the hippocampal blood flow, the 11-year cognitive youth finding from the Rush University study, and I asked her to eat 1 to 2 cups of dark leafy greens every day for 6 months alongside the other 3 foods. At her 6-month follow-up, Miriam told me something that I want to share with you exactly as she said it. She said it feels like someone turned the brightness back up, not dramatically, not like a switch, like a dial being slowly turned. Things she had been searching for were more accessible. Words came more readily. She felt more present in conversations, more able to hold the thread of complex exchanges without losing it midway. Her formal cognitive testing at 6 months showed improvement in verbal memory and processing speed that was modest but measurable and that moved in the opposite direction from what I would have expected given her initial assessment and the natural trajectory of her risk profile. I am not claiming that 4 foods reversed Miriam's cognitive decline. I am telling you exactly what happened in one patient who took the science seriously and applied it consistently. And I am telling you that what happened was not nothing. It was something real, something measurable, and something that gave Miriam a sense of agency over her own brain health that she had not had before she walked into my office. That sense of agency is what I want to give you today. The myth that memory decline after 60 is purely a one-direction inevitable process that diet cannot meaningfully influence is not what the research shows. The truth is more nuanced, more hopeful, and more actionable than most people over 60 have ever been told directly and clearly by someone with the clinical context to make it credible. You now have that truth. And you have 4 specific foods: 1 cup of blueberries daily, 2 to 3 servings of fatty fish per week, a daily serving of fermented food, and 1 to 2 cups of dark leafy greens every day with a source of healthy fat that deliver the compounds the research most consistently associates with memory protection, neural repair, and cognitive resilience in the aging brain. Which of these 4 foods are you already eating consistently, and which one are you going to add starting tomorrow? Tell me in the comments. Not just because I want to know, but because committing to something in writing, even in a comment on a video, makes it measurably more likely to actually happen. And your answer might be exactly the nudge someone else reading along needs to make the same commitment. Share this video with someone over 60 who has been told or who believes that there is nothing meaningful they can do about their memory. Because this information deserves to reach the people who need it most. And subscribe, because my next video goes deeper into the neuroscience of memory protection after 60. Specifically, the 3 daily habits that amplify everything these 4 foods do for your brain, and that together with the right diet produce the most meaningful cognitive resilience available to any adult in this age group. You are going to want that one.